The air in Osprey, Florida, felt mild that late December, with the quiet softness of evening settling over a small house on Nokomis Avenue. Inside, ordinary things remained in their places, the kind of details investigators notice first when a home has suddenly gone still. In 1959, the Walker family became the center of a case that would not yield to quick answers or easy theories. So you find yourself, in a sense, seated beside the file as it begins, turning over names, times, small observations, and the patient notes of deputies doing careful work. There were neighbors to speak with, recent travels to trace, and a family history to piece together without haste. The evidence was limited, but not absent. And even in those first days, there were signs that this would be a case solved, if at all, by persistence rather than speed. Years would pass, then decades, while boxes were stored, reports were reread, and old material waited for methods not yet invented. And that is what makes the Walker case so quietly remarkable. Not a sudden breakthrough, but a long conversation between the past and the people willing to keep listening. Tonight, we can follow that conversation slowly and see how one unanswered file finally gave back a name after 41 years. The first deputies who entered the house were not stepping into chaos so much as into a sudden and troubling stillness. That distinction mattered, because stillness can suggest its own kind of order. An order can tell investigators where to begin. They identified the family quickly: Cliff Walker, his wife Christine, and their two children, Jimmy and Debbie. The names turned the scene from an address into a file with weight, because names always do that. Cliff was known as a traveling minister and religious worker, a man whose days often involved motion, conversation, and introductions to strangers. Christine was remembered as warm and organized, the sort of person who made temporary places feel settled. The children were young, and that simple fact changed the way the whole community held the case in its mind. The sheriff's office had an immediate decision to make: treat the house as the center of the mystery, or begin just as urgently with the road that had brought the family there. For the moment, they chose the house first. That choice was practical. You secure what is in front of you before memory blurs, before weather changes something small, before a footprint fades, before a door handle loses its meaning. Deputies noted the placement of furniture, the state of rooms, the simple domestic details that can say whether an evening had begun normally. Nothing about the home suggested a burglary in the ordinary sense. There was no broad sign of searching, no careless scattering meant to disguise intent, no loud signature of panic. Instead, investigators found a scene that seemed controlled, and that control became the first real escalation in the file. A careful scene suggests preparation. Preparation suggests someone who arrived with purpose. And once that idea enters an investigation, every early question changes shape. Now the deputies were no longer asking only who might have come by the house. They were asking who might have known enough to come prepared, and why the Walkers, recently arrived, would have drawn that attention at all. Among the physical items collected were shell casings, small objects with a very large future. At the time, they were evidence in the plainest sense, things to be tagged, stored, compared if possible, and protected from loss. But even then, they carried a quiet promise. Metal keeps its patience better than memory does. The house itself could only answer so much, so officers stepped back out into the neighborhood and began the oldest work in any case, asking people what they had seen, what they had heard, and what they almost failed to notice. A nearby resident might remember a car. Another might remember a knock at an unusual hour. Someone else might recall a visitor who did not belong on that street. These early canvases rarely produce a complete answer. What they produce are fragments. And in Osprey, the fragments arrived exactly that way. Neighbors described an ordinary area, modest and calm, where movement was noticeable precisely because there was usually so little of it. That helped, but only a little. A quiet neighborhood can preserve memory, yet it can also make any unfamiliar detail feel more important than it really is. So investigators had to sort the useful from the merely memorable. One report drew attention to a vehicle seen near the house. Another pointed to sounds noticed at a distance, though time estimates varied in the way they often do after an unsettling discovery. A third suggested the family had been alive and visible later than some had first assumed. Each statement shifted the possible timeline by an inch. And in an old case, an inch can become a mile. The sheriff's office widened its circle. Church contacts were identified. Local workers were interviewed. Anyone who had helped the family settle in, spoken with them recently, or seen them during the holiday period was added to the growing list. This was not dramatic work. It was slower than that. Names were written carefully, dates were cross-checked, conversations were repeated, because the second telling of a memory is sometimes clearer than the first. What investigators learned early was both helpful and difficult. The Walkers had been visible, friendly, and open to meeting people. That meant there were many possible encounters to trace. It also meant the case could not be narrowed simply by asking who knew the family well. A stranger might matter just as much as an acquaintance. That possibility changed the scope of the file almost immediately. If the person responsible was not rooted in Osprey, then the house was only the final stop in a much longer line of events. And if the line stretched backward, then detectives would need to reconstruct not just a night, but a journey. Before they could do that, though, they had to settle another basic question. Was there anyone close to the family whose name demanded early and sustained attention? This is where old investigations often become very human. You look first at what is nearest, not because nearest is always guilty, but because nearest is easiest to test. So officers reviewed the family's recent associations, work, finances, and personal contacts. Nothing obvious rose immediately to the surface. There were no simple local grudges waiting to be uncovered. No clear dispute in Osprey explained the precision of the scene. That absence was not proof of anything, but it had a consequence. Without a natural suspect close at hand, detectives had to preserve uncertainty rather than resolve it. And that meant building the file wider, not narrower. The Walkers had come to Florida from Illinois, and that fact began to pull the investigation northward in thought, even before it moved there in practice. Cliff and Christine were associated with religious literature distribution, a life that involved travel, brief contacts, and many doors opened in trust. That detail had a quiet importance. It suggested exposure, not to one known enemy, necessarily, but to many passing observations. A family like that could be seen by dozens of people who left no lasting name behind. As officers traced the last known days, they began with the simple mechanics of travel. Where had the family stopped? Who had spoken with them? Which roads had they taken south? Where had they been expected, and by whom? These questions were basic, but together they formed the first real strategy of the investigation. If the answer was not in the house, perhaps it was on the road. That idea required another decision. Limited manpower could remain focused on Sarasota County, or it could stretch into a broader search that might produce little in return. The broader search won. It had to. Because once detectives accepted that the Walkers' movements mattered, every town on the route became a possible place where someone first noticed them. And once that possibility existed, the case became harder to contain. Letters were sent, telephone calls were made, agencies and contacts outside the county were asked to check records, recollections, and local reports. This was the late 1950s, and coordination across distance did not happen with a keystroke. It happened by persistence. A question asked in Florida might wait days before it was answered in Illinois. Sometimes longer. That slowness shaped the case from the beginning. You can feel it in the file. A report leads to a name. The name leads to a town. The town leads to a minister, a landlord, a gas station, a church contact, a roadside memory. Then the paper waits for the next paper. Meanwhile, the local investigation continued at ground level. Deputies revisited the house. Evidence was checked again. Measurements were reviewed. The shell casings remained important because they hinted at a weapon type and therefore at a category of person who might have carried it. Ballistic comparison in that era had limits, of course, but even limited science can narrow possibilities. If investigators could connect the weapon to another offense, or even to a certain pattern, then the case might move out of isolation. So they looked for parallels. They checked known offenders. They considered burglaries that had turned more serious elsewhere. They searched for reports involving armed drifters, prowlers, and men with histories of entering homes. Nothing held firmly. Each comparison seemed plausible for a moment, then weakened on inspection. And that repeated disappointment did something subtle to the Walker file. It made the case feel older than it was. A case begins to age the moment leads stop deepening. Still, there were enough details to prevent surrender. The family's recent arrival in Florida mattered. The apparent control at the scene mattered. The physical evidence mattered. And so detectives kept moving between two possibilities. Either the answer was local, hidden inside ordinary community knowledge, or it had traveled in with the family unnoticed until the end. That second theory gained strength as the family's final days were reconstructed more carefully. The Walkers had not simply appeared in Osprey from nowhere. They had traveled south during the Christmas season, carrying out religious work and visiting along the way. People remembered them because they were approachable. That warmth, so often recalled later, made the investigation more painful and more complex at once. A warm family accumulates contacts, but contacts are not suspects. At some point, detectives had to choose which memories were meaningful enough to chase. That meant weighing stories that were sincere but vague. A man seen at a roadside stop, a conversation after a church visit, a vehicle behind another vehicle for too many miles, or perhaps not enough to matter. The difficulty was not lack of information. It was the nature of information gathered after shock. People remember pieces. The mind rounds time. Distance shortens. Weather alters. Investigators knew this, so they worked carefully, comparing statements for overlap rather than perfect agreement. Patterns, not precision, became the goal. One pattern did begin to emerge. The Walkers seemed to have been noticed by many people during their journey, which widened the chance that someone had taken an unhealthy interest in them before they ever reached Nokomis Avenue. That possibility was unsettling for detectives, not because it was dramatic, but because it was expansive. A local case can be walked. A travel case has to be assembled, and every mile added more silence between clues. As winter turned and the first urgency of discovery gave way to routine effort, the file thickened. Photographs were filed. Interview summaries were typed. Maps were marked. Names were entered and re-entered as new context arrived. This is often the point where a case reveals its temperament. Some investigations burn fast, then collapse. Others move in quiet circles, returning to the same details until one of them changes shape. The Walker case was clearly the second kind. Even the family's belongings had to be considered with care. What had they carried south? What papers had they kept close? Was anything missing that should have been present, or present that should have been missing? Questions like these sound small, but they matter because travelers carry their timeline with them. Receipts, printed literature, notes, maps, address books, each item can place a person in motion, and motion was now central to everything. Detectives learned more about Cliff Walker's ministry and the family's religious work. He distributed literature, spoke with people, and moved through communities with a degree of openness that belonged to that mission. This was admirable. It was also investigative trouble. A life built on trust creates a long list of unknown observers. Someone might have crossed the family's path only once and still become important. That idea pushed investigators to think about motive differently. Not a local feud, perhaps. Not a family dispute in the ordinary sense. Maybe something more opportunistic. Maybe someone who encountered the Walkers briefly, then followed through on an intention that had little to do with Osprey itself. Yet opportunity alone could not close the gap. Detectives still needed a person who could be placed near the route, near the family, or near the house. Without that, theory remained theory. So the work returned, again and again, to documentation. Where had the Walkers last been seen with confidence? Who could confirm those sightings? Which stops were certain and which were only assumed later? This kind of reconstruction is painstaking, and in 1959 it was even more so. No automated records. No location trails from devices. Only paper, memory, and the old discipline of asking twice. As more of the timeline took shape, one uncomfortable truth settled in. The family had been moving through public space enough that the person responsible may have blended into ordinary travel. A motorist, a passerby, a stranger who looked like any other stranger. That made the suspect both harder to imagine and easier to miss. The file did not yet have a central villain. It had a set of conditions: a family on the road, a visible ministry, a final stop in Florida, a careful scene, shell casings preserved, and no answer close enough to touch. By then, the sheriff's office could see the outline of the challenge ahead. There would be no quick arrest built on a single witness, no easy confession waiting in a neighboring town. What there would be instead was accumulation, one detail beside another, one report leaning on the next. The kind of case where patience is not a virtue added later, but the main tool from the start. And so the investigation shifted, almost without announcing that it had shifted, from shock to method. Deputies and detectives kept speaking with those who had crossed paths with the Walkers. They traced recent movements. They measured what could be measured. They tested each small lead against the family's last known days. Because once the first interviews were finished, and no arrest stood near, the only way forward was to let the road into Florida become part of the crime scene too. That was when the Walker case began to grow larger and quieter at the same time. The house on Nokomis Avenue remained the center, but the miles before it were starting to ask their own questions. And somewhere in those miles, investigators suspected was the first moment the family had been seen by the wrong man. To understand that possibility, detectives had to do something both simple and exhausting. They had to rebuild the Walkers' last trip, one remembered stop at a time. Cliff and Christine had been traveling south from Illinois with their children, carrying religious literature, meeting people, and moving with the easy openness that was part of their work. That openness left a long trail. It also left a very crowded trail. When a family is friendly, almost every brief encounter sounds meaningful later. A station attendant remembers a smile. A church contact remembers a conversation. A motel clerk remembers children in the car. A passerby remembers a license plate only in fragments. Investigators had to separate affection from evidence. That is one of the quieter burdens in a case like this. People want to help. They search their memory sincerely. But sincere memory is not always precise memory. So the route south became a map covered in different kinds of certainty. Some stops could be documented clearly. Some could only be inferred. Some lived in the uncertain space between a receipt, a recollection, and an assumption that seemed reasonable at the time. The Walkers had connections through religious work, and that gave detectives a network to contact. That was useful. It was also time-consuming. Each church connection, each literature contact, each person who had expected a visit or remembered one had to be interviewed with care. You can imagine the pace of it. A call placed from Florida, a note taken in shorthand, a follow-up letter. A local officer in another town asked to knock on a door and ask whether anyone recalled a family passing through during the holiday season. The file began to spread outward in rings. Illinois remained important, not only because the family had come from there, but because someone encountered before the trip ended might matter more than anyone met in Florida. That widened the case in a way that could not be undone. Now, investigators were not just asking who knew the Walkers in Osprey. They were asking who had seen them anywhere. That question is broad enough to feel almost impossible. Still, old investigations often depend on asking impossible questions patiently. Cliff Walker's work involved distributing religious materials, and that meant speaking with strangers in towns and along roads where no lasting record would naturally exist. He and his family were visible in exactly the way traveling ministry makes a family visible. Not famous, not hidden, simply available to notice. This detail matters because a visible family may appear safe to themselves and memorable to others, while also becoming vulnerable to someone whose attention is unhealthy or predatory. Investigators did not yet know if that had happened. but they had to allow for it. The family's route into Florida became more than travel history. It became a field of possible first contact. That changed how every witness statement was read. A person who seemed irrelevant under a local theory might become central under a travel theory. A car seen behind the walkers for a stretch of road might be ordinary traffic. Or it might not. A man who asked too many questions at a roadside stop might be forgettable. Or he might be the beginning of the whole case. The trouble was that there were very few details firm enough to hold in the hand. Investigators heard about sightings in different places. They heard descriptions of encounters that sounded innocent. They heard second-hand remarks that could not be fully verified. And each time they had to ask the same questions. When was this? Who else was present? What exactly was said? How certain are you that it was this family? Could the date be wrong by a day? Could the location be off by 10 miles? This is not glamorous work. It is repetitive. But repetition is how an uncertain timeline becomes less uncertain. At some point, detectives began to consider whether the person they were looking for might have seen the walkers during one of these routine public moments and then chosen to follow. That idea had force because it matched the absence of a local personal motive. It also matched the appearance of control at the house. A person who followed a family and arrived prepared would fit the scene better than a random local intruder with no prior observation. But a theory that fits is not the same as proof. The file still lacked a person, and without a person, detectives had to keep moving through possibilities that remained broad and unsatisfying. One challenge was the season itself. The Christmas period brings travel, visiting, irregular schedules, and blurred recollections. Roads are busier. People are distracted. A memory from late December may attach itself to the holiday rather than to a precise date. That made witness interviews harder. It also made timeline reconstruction slower than anyone would have wanted. Still, some patterns continued to interest investigators. The walkers had not been isolated in the days before they reached Osprey. They had been seen. They had spoken with others. They had continued the ordinary work of ministry and travel. That meant the case did not feel sealed within the walls of one house. It felt porous. Things from outside could have entered it. You can sense why that became the central working idea. If the killer was not rooted in Osprey, then conventional local screening would only take the investigation so far. That did not mean local interviews stopped. They did not. Neighbors were revisited. Timing was checked again. Reports about vehicles, sounds, and possible visitors were reconsidered. But the emotional center of the inquiry shifted. The case was no longer a puzzle sitting entirely in one neighborhood. It was a moving puzzle, and moving puzzles are harder to solve because they shed context as they go. One by one, detectives tested ordinary explanations. Could this have been a burglary that turned by some terrible path into something larger? The condition of the scene argued against a simple version of that. Could there have been a dispute connected to the family's work? No strong evidence of one emerged early. Could there have been someone from the past, known in Illinois or elsewhere, whose connection to the family had not yet been recognized? That possibility remained open, though it too lacked a clear name. So the file entered the uneasy middle stage that many major cases reach. Not the beginning, where every lead feels fresh. Not the end, where a theory hardens. But the long middle, where detectives work against uncertainty and try not to mistake motion for progress. There is something almost archival about this phase. A name is written down, then another. Addresses are copied carefully, telephone numbers are checked, license information is requested where possible. A lead from one state is compared against a note from another. And all the while, the case grows thicker without necessarily growing clearer. This is where patience stops being an admirable trait and becomes a procedural necessity. Without patience, the file would collapse into guesswork. With patience, it remained open to future use, even if the present was not yielding enough. The sheriff's office and other investigators had to think in layers. First, preserve what can be preserved. Second, identify every credible contact. Third, compare what is local with what is mobile. Fourth, keep enough order in the file that someone later can understand what has already been done. That last part is easy to overlook, but it would become one of the most important acts in the whole history of the case, because a case that lasts decades survives only if its paperwork survives with it. The notes from 1959 mattered. The discipline of not losing small things mattered. At the time, those choices would have felt ordinary. Later, they would feel almost prophetic. For now, though, the investigation remained rooted in the tools of its own era. Ballistics could be consulted, comparisons could be attempted, witnesses could be located and re-questioned, known offenders could be reviewed. But there was no modern database ready to connect one county's fragments to another county's suspect in seconds. There was no genetic genealogy, no broad digital search through decades of arrests and relatives. Instead, there were filing systems, memory, telephones, paper correspondence, and the old discipline of preserving doubt until it earned the right to narrow. When detectives looked at the shell casings, they were seeing one of the few fixed points in the file. Metal does not revise itself. A witness may later second-guess a date. A neighbor may confuse one car for another. A roadside clerk may shift a memory by a day. But a physical item, if stored well, waits in the same form. That is why the shell casings kept their importance, not because they solved anything then, but because they represented continuity. They linked the earliest hours of the case to every later reinvestigation. They were part of the promise the file made to the future. The same was true of other preserved material. Investigators did not yet know what future science would ask from the evidence. They only knew they had to keep it. You can almost feel the quiet humility in that act. They were storing answers they could not yet read. As leads continued to spread across states and communities, officers also had to face a more practical problem. Attention fades. Cases that begin with community focus slowly become background memory, unless something new renews them. The Walker case resisted that fading more than many would have. The reason was simple and human. It involved an entire family. People remembered the names, they remembered the children, they remembered the Christmas season. They remembered that the family had come to Florida for work rooted in faith and ordinary trust. That combination gave the case a staying power that was emotional as much as investigative. Yet public memory and investigative progress are not the same thing. The case could remain present in local conversation and still remain unsolved. That is, in fact, what happened. The months after the murders brought continued effort, but not the decisive break detectives needed. Persons of interest were considered and then moved aside. Comparisons to other crimes were entertained and then weakened. Travel theories remained plausible, but rarely specific enough to produce a strong suspect. A case can live for years in that state. Not dead, not solved, simply waiting. As 1960 gave way to the years after it, the Walker file entered a different emotional climate. The early urgency of fresh interviews was gone. What remained was maintenance, review, and periodic revival. That may sound passive, but it is not. To keep an old case viable is work. Reports must be preserved. Evidence must be tracked. New detectives must be brought into old logic without inheriting old assumptions too blindly. And each generation of investigators has to decide whether the file still contains something recoverable. In the Walker case, many believed that it did. That belief did not always produce a breakthrough, but it prevented abandonment. Through the early years, detectives looked for connections to known offenders. They compared the crime, cautiously, to incidents involving armed intruders, prowlers, and men who had entered homes before. Some possibilities may have looked stronger for a season than they did later. That is common in long investigations. A suspect can seem promising when viewed from one angle, then lose coherence when alibis, geography, or chronology are tested more closely. The important thing is not that every theory succeeds. It is that the file records why a theory failed. That way, later investigators do not waste years rediscovering the same dead ends. In practical terms, The Walker case became one of those files that experienced officers remember almost as a category of its own, not because it was constantly active, but because it was never quite at rest. There would be spurts of attention, a new angle, a revived comparison, a call from another agency, a reporter asking what had become of the case, a family member wondering whether anything had changed. Then quiet again. Then another review. This pulse can continue for decades. And in this case, it did. The technology of the mid-century investigation imposed limits that today feel almost physical. No integrated national networks of the kind later generations would rely upon. No rapid way to compare every old report against every later offense. No ability to recover a genetic identity from trace material the way modern cold case teams can. Even simple communication could be slow. If a useful question depended on another town's records, then someone had to locate those records, interpret them, and respond. If a lead crossed state lines, the effort multiplied. This is one reason old, unsolved cases deserve patience from later readers. What seems obvious in hindsight was often impossible in real time. Investigators in 1959 were not failing to use modern tools. They did not have them. They were doing meticulous work with the methods available. That distinction matters. It keeps us from judging the file unfairly. It also helps explain why preserved evidence became so important as the decades passed. When science is limited, storage is strategy. Keep the casings, keep the reports, keep the chain of custody, keep the notes on where things were found, keep the photographs labeled correctly. One day, the file may be asked a new question, and if the materials are gone, the answer is gone with them. The Walker investigation moved into the 1960s with this quiet burden. There were questions enough, there were methods enough to keep trying, but there was not yet the one development that would make the case newly solvable. So detectives and deputies continued in the old way. They revisited statements. They checked rumors. They heard from people who believed, often sincerely, that they might hold a missing piece. Some of these tips would have been small, some contradictory, some impossible to verify. A few may have seemed promising for a while, but no single path carried the case over the line. That is the hard truth of the long, cold stretch. Time is not neutral. It erodes. Witnesses move away. Memories soften. Records disappear if no one protects them. Even the meaning of a neighborhood can change as roads expand, houses age, and generations replace one another. A detective opening an old file after many years is not merely reviewing evidence, he is trying to hear a voice through static. Still, old cases also gain something from time. They gain perspective. They gain the chance that a suspect, once hidden among too many possibilities, may later resemble someone known in another context. They gain, too, the possibility that science will one day do what memory could not. That slow exchange between loss and opportunity defined the Walker case. There were years when the file would have felt stubbornly fixed, the names unchanged, the central mystery intact, the evidence boxed. And yet, in another sense, the file was evolving quietly even while it sat. The world around it was changing. Forensic science was advancing. Record systems were improving. The idea of a dedicated cold case review would become more established over time, and each of those changes increased the value of what had been preserved back at the beginning. It is worth pausing on that. When a deputy in 1959 labels evidence carefully, he is doing more than closing out a shift. He is sending a message to the future. He is saying, in effect, this may matter later, even if it does not solve the case now. The people who kept the Walker materials intact could not know exactly how later investigators would use them, but they made later use possible. That is a form of detective work, too. As the case aged, it also settled into local memory with a certain solemn familiarity. Reporters would return to it from time to time. Community members would mention it as one of those stories that never fully left the region. The Walker family remained present, not only as victims in a file, but as people whose names were still spoken together. Cliff, Christine, Jimmy, Debbie, Forenames can do a lot of work in a community's memory. They resist abstraction, they keep a case human. That human presence mattered because it helps sustain official interest through long periods without a break. Cases that are completely forgotten rarely solve themselves. Cases that are remembered have a chance, even if the chance is small, for many years. Some investigators, too, carried the file in a personal way, not obsessively perhaps, but steadily. An old case can become part of a detective's internal map of unfinished work. He may retire without solving it. Another may inherit it and feel both freedom and pressure. Freedom, because time has loosened old assumptions. Pressure, because the unanswered years are now part of the case itself. The Walker file would pass through these hands across generations. That continuity is rarely neat. Files are moved, officers change, personnel turnover, priorities shift, yet the central materials endure if the institution takes its duty seriously. Here, enough endured, and because enough endured, the possibility of later science remained alive. By the later decades of the 20th century, forensic thinking had changed dramatically from what the original investigators could have imagined. The concept of identifying a person through biological material had become real, then more refined, then increasingly central to cold case work. Cases that had once depended mostly on witness memory and circumstantial comparison could now be reconsidered through laboratory analysis. But every old file presented the same threshold question. Was there anything testable left? In some cases, the answer is no. Evidence has been lost, degraded, contaminated, or handled in ways that make later testing impossible. In the Walker case, the answer was more hopeful. Not simple, not immediate, but hopeful. That hope did not arrive all at once. Cold case review is often gradual. First, someone inventories the evidence. Then, chain of custody records are checked. Then, laboratories are consulted about whether old material might still yield anything useful. Then, budgets, permissions, and priorities all have to align. And because old evidence can be fragile, each decision must be made carefully. You do not get endless chances to test a preserved item from a case this old. By the time modern review began to gather real force, the Walker murders had long been part of Florida's unsolved history. The case had outlasted not only early leads, but errors. New generations knew it as an old mystery. That perception can be dangerous if it leads people to think the file belongs only to history. But it can also be useful if it prompts a fresh look free from assumptions that hardened decades earlier. Cold case units and later investigators increasingly approached files like this one with a particular discipline. Do not begin with the romance of the mystery. Begin with the inventory. What is in storage? What condition is it in? What documentation survives? What questions can modern science ask that earlier science could not? In the Walker case, that practical attitude mattered. It shifted the file from story back to evidence, and that shift is often the beginning of real progress. The review of preserved material meant revisiting everything the old file had protected. Items collected in the first investigation were no longer just relics. They were potential sources. Potential of what kind was the new question. Not every item would matter equally. Not every sample would yield a result. But the fact that there were things to test at all changed the mood of the case. Quietly and without drama, the Walker murders moved from a file remembered for endurance into a file that might actually answer something. This is the point where old cases often feel transformed, not solved, not even close sometimes, but changed in kind. Before modern analysis, the unknown suspect was a figure built from witness descriptions, inferred behavior, and physical evidence that could only go so far. After modern analysis becomes possible, the unknown suspect may become measurable in a new way. That difference cannot be overstated. It gives investigators an anchor that memory alone cannot provide. The reopening of evidence demanded patience of another sort. Laboratory work takes time. Historical evidence is not rushed if it is being handled properly. Technicians and investigators had to decide what should be tested first, what was most likely to produce interpretable results. and what documentation would support any conclusion reached later. The file, in other words, had to become legible across decades. An item collected in 1959 had to be understood by people working many years later in a different scientific world. When that translation succeeds, it can feel almost miraculous. But really, it is administrative diligence meeting scientific progress. The miracle, if there is one, is in the continuity. At some stage in this renewed work, biological evidence from the case became central. That was the irreversible turning point. The exact path from preserved material to usable result was technical, careful, and the opposite of cinematic. There were no dramatic revelations in a single afternoon. Instead, progress came in stages, each one small enough that, on its own, it might have seemed almost ordinary. One lab result would confirm that a sample still held usable material. Then another review would decide whether the material was strong enough for more advanced testing. Then an evidence log from decades earlier would be checked again to make sure the path from collection to storage could still be explained clearly. That chain mattered, because an old case cannot simply be revived by hope. It has to be revived by discipline. Investigators needed confidence that what they were testing truly belonged to the Walker case and had remained identifiable across all the years in between. So the cold case review became part science, part history lesson. People had to understand not only what the evidence was, but how it had traveled through time. That meant old labels, old handwriting, old packaging, old property sheets. Details that had once looked administrative now became central. You can picture a detective at a table not chasing someone through a street, but comparing inventory numbers from one decade to another. That is what solving an old mystery often looks like. A line on a form, a notation in fading ink, a sealed item that was kept when it might easily have been discarded. When the biological material was tested with modern methods, the most important outcome was not immediate identification. It was the creation of a stable DNA profile from the unknown man tied to the crime. That changed the Walker case at a fundamental level. For decades, the suspect had been a concept. Now, he was also a profile. That distinction is quiet but enormous. A concept depends on interpretation. A profile can be compared. A concept drifts as theories change. A profile remains itself. Once investigators had that profile, the case no longer depended only on whether an old witness might remember a face or whether an old suspect list might happen to contain the right name. Now there was something fixed to work from, something that could move through databases, something that could be tested against other material, something that could point outward beyond the limits of the original investigation. Even then, there was no instant answer. Modern forensic work often sounds fast when it is summarized years later, but in real time, it unfolds slowly. The profile had to be evaluated for quality. The proper comparisons had to be chosen. Investigators had to decide what route made the most sense. Was there a direct match in available law enforcement systems? Was there a near match? Was there any indication that the unknown man had ever been identified elsewhere through official records? Those early efforts did not immediately solve the case. That is important. The new science did not produce a name the moment it was applied. What it produced first was direction. And direction, in a case this old, is a major development. For years, the Walker file had expanded outward in almost every direction at once. Now, for the first time, the evidence itself was narrowing the field. Detectives were no longer asking only, who among all these possible men might fit this crime? They were also asking, whose biology fits the preserved evidence? That second question is cleaner. It is less vulnerable to rumor. It does not depend on personality or reputation alone, but it also required investigators to learn a newer language of evidence. Cold case detectives are often translators as much as investigators. They translate old paperwork into modern procedure. They translate scientific findings into practical next steps. They translate uncertainty into testable decisions. In the Walker case, once the DNA profile existed, the next strategic question became obvious. If the unknown man's name was not already sitting in a conventional law enforcement database, then another route would be needed. By that time, forensic genealogy had begun to change the landscape of long unsolved cases. This method was still careful, still controversial in some circles, and still developing. But it had already shown that a DNA profile could sometimes identify not the person directly, but his relatives. And from relatives, if the trees were built patiently enough, investigators could move toward the one person who fit the time, place, sex, and age. This was not magic. It was elimination in a new form. The process began with a DNA profile from the case being prepared for genealogical use. That itself required expertise. A crime scene profile built for one kind of comparison is not always ready for another kind. Specialists had to convert, interpret, and upload in ways that fit the rules and technology being used. Then came the waiting. That waiting had a familiar feeling, even though the method was new. The Walker case had always involved pauses. Only now the pauses belonged to laboratories, databases, and family tree analysis, rather than roadside interviews and mailed inquiries. Investigators would receive not a suspect, but relative matches. People genetically connected at varying distances. A second cousin, perhaps, or the descendant of a shared great-grandparent, not close enough to solve the case by itself, close enough to start building. This is where genealogy becomes a kind of quiet architecture. You begin with names that are not the answer. Then you ask who their grandparents were, then who those grandparents' siblings were, then where those branches moved, married, separated, and changed surnames. The work is meticulous and, in its own way, gentle. No doors are kicked in, no dramatic accusation is made. Instead, records are assembled. Census entries, birth records, marriage licenses, obituaries, military papers, court records, city directories. The dead and the living are placed in relation to one another until a tree begins to look less like a tangle and more like a map. For the Walker investigation, this meant working across generations. The unknown DNA did not announce, "I belong to this man." It said something softer. "I belong somewhere in this family network. Find where." That is patient work, and it can take a very long time. One promising branch may turn out to lead to sons too young to matter. Another may point to men who never lived in the right region. Another may produce a cluster of relatives, but no clear line to Florida in the relevant period. Each branch has to be tested against real-world facts: age, geography, opportunity, history, sex, sometimes profession or military service, sometimes old arrest records, sometimes a habit of drifting from place to place. At first, the family tree would have been broader than useful. That is normal. Genealogists often begin with a wide web of possible ancestors and descendants. Then they prune, not by guessing, but by constraints. The unknown man in the Walker case had to be old enough to commit the crime in late December of 1959. He had to be male, he had to fit the broad biological profile. And, if the developing theory held, he had to be someone whose movements could plausibly intersect with the Walker's route or with Florida at that time. Those constraints begin to reduce the number of serious candidates. Still, reducing is not the same as identifying. Investigators and genealogists had to live with uncertainty for a while, even after the DNA profile changed the case. There may have been moments when a branch looked especially promising. There may have been moments when a likely path dissolved, because one record contradicted another. That is the rhythm of this kind of work. A possibility strengthens. Then it has to survive contact with facts. If it does not, it is set aside. The Walker file had always taught patience. Now it demanded a newer version of the same virtue. As genealogical research deepened, a more defined cluster of relatives began to emerge. This was the point where the broad question of family line slowly became a narrower question of individual men. Within the tree, some names would stand out for practical reasons. A man of the right age, a man with a history of criminal behavior, a man known to move around, A man whose documented life did not stay neatly in one place. A man who could plausibly have passed through Florida or crossed paths with a family traveling south. That does not mean investigators leap to a conclusion. A family tree lead is not enough, not in a case this serious. Genealogy is a pointer, not a verdict. But once branch starts to align with age and circumstance, detectives know where to focus their archival effort. That focus began to draw attention toward a man named William Lowell Kane. His name did not arrive with theatrical certainty. It emerged from the narrowing process, from records, from relationships, from the gradual exclusion of other lines. Kane fit the profile in more than one way. He was a white male of the right general age range. His background suggested a life that did not move in orderly, settled patterns. And, importantly, his history included serious criminal conduct. That history mattered not because it proved the Walker crime by itself, but because it made him more than just a genealogical abstraction. He was a real person with a documented capacity for dangerous behavior. At this stage, the investigation had to shift again. The first phase of genealogical work asks, which family line? The second asks, which person in that line? The third asks, can you support that identification with evidence beyond the tree? So detectives began pulling older records connected to Kane, addresses, arrests, institutional records, movement across states, whatever could be located and compared. The challenge was that Kane, by then, was no longer alive. That changed the nature of the inquiry. There would be no interview with the suspect, no chance to observe his reactions, no warrant to collect a direct DNA sample from him in the present. The case had become one of historical identification. Can you prove, reliably and publicly, that this dead man is the same unknown man whose DNA was preserved from the crime? That standard required care. Investigators had to think, like both detectives and future witnesses. If they eventually named Kane, they would need to explain how they got there, step by step, in a way that could withstand scrutiny. That meant no shortcuts. It also meant genealogy alone would never be enough. They needed biological confirmation through his relatives. And before they reached that point, they wanted as much contextual support as possible. So the old file expanded again, though in a more directed way than before. This time, the expansion was not toward every possible suspect. It was toward one emerging suspect, and the life around him. Where had he lived? What crimes had he committed? What years was he free and mobile? Was he ever in the South? Did he have documented ties, or at least plausible routes, into Florida? Did his known patterns match anything investigators had long suspected about the Walker killer? One of the reasons Kane became increasingly important was that his life fit the broad shape of a man who could have committed such a crime and disappeared back into the wider landscape. He was not a stable local figure in Osprey whose presence would have been obvious to all. He was the kind of person who could enter and leave, and whose name would not naturally appear in neighborhood memory. That fit the original travel-based theory in a striking way. A man encountered on the road, or a man moving through the same broad space, had always been one possible explanation. Now the evidence was giving that theory a body. Even so, the work remained methodical. Genealogy can suggest a person, but detectives still have to account for timing. They reviewed whether Kane's age in 1959 was consistent. It was. They reviewed whether his broader criminal history made him a plausible offender. It did. They looked at his family line to determine what living biological relatives might help confirm the identification. And they had to do all of this respectfully, because relatives are not suspects simply by sharing blood. That is another quiet feature of modern cold case work. The science may point toward a family, but the investigators still have to approach living people with care. Imagine receiving word that your relative's name is being examined in connection with a decades-old murder case. Even if that relative died long ago, the news would settle heavily. So the next phase required both precision and restraint. Investigators identified Kane's surviving biological relatives and considered how to obtain comparison samples lawfully and ethically. The goal was not to implicate those relatives. The goal was to use their DNA to determine whether the unknown profile could indeed belong within Cain's immediate family line. This is where biology becomes a language of probability. A relative will not share an identical profile unless the relationship is very close in a particular way. But the patterns of inheritance can show whether the unknown man could be the father, brother, or close male relative of the people tested. If the relationships line up strongly enough, the genealogical conclusion gains real force. Before that confirmation arrived, though, detectives continued building Cain's background, and his history gave the case more shape. William Lowell Cain had a violent criminal past, again not as proof by itself, but as context that mattered. He was not an ordinary citizen suddenly dragged into suspicion by a family tree coincidence. He had records that showed serious offenses and a life marked by instability and predation. That, combined with the genetic lead, pushed investigators further toward him. There was also the question of his movement. One challenge in old cases is reconstructing where a person was at a specific time decades earlier. Employment records may be incomplete, addresses may reflect only brief periods, memories may be gone entirely. So detectives looked for indirect ways to assess whether Cain could have been in the relevant areas. Could he have been in Florida around late 1959? Could he have traveled along the route the walkers used? Could his known habits and history place him in exactly the sort of transient space that had long concerned investigators? They may not have found a tidy travel diary. Old cases rarely provide that. What they were assembling instead was a mosaic. Genealogy placed him in the biological line. Criminal history established his capacity. Movement patterns suggested opportunity, and the original scene, carefully preserved, had always indicated a prepared offender rather than a random neighborhood dispute. The pieces were beginning to settle around one man. You can feel, at this point in the case, the difference between attention and proof. For many years, detectives had attention in all directions. Now they had attention concentrated. But they still needed that final biological bridge. Without it, the case would remain persuasive, but incomplete. So the work of obtaining reference DNA became central. This was not quick. Families are complex. Records are incomplete. Some relatives may be hard to locate. Some may have passed away. Others may need time to understand why investigators are asking. And because the suspect himself was dead, there could be no direct cheek swab from the person at the center of the theory. Everything depended on the family line. As that process moved forward, another form of historical work continued alongside it. Investigators reviewed reports about Cain's earlier crimes and life circumstances to understand his habits and range. Was he the sort of man who targeted vulnerable people? Did he move alone? Did he travel opportunistically? Did he leave other regions with unsolved questions behind him? This context would not solve the DNA issue, but it mattered for the full picture. Cold case identifications, especially those announced publicly after a suspect's death, are strongest when the biology and the biography support each other. In Cain's case, they increasingly did. The Walker case had begun as a local tragedy with no obvious suspect close at hand. It had evolved into a travel theory without a name, then into a preserved evidence case waiting for science. Now, at last, it was becoming a case with both a profile and a likely owner. That progression did not erase the decades in between. It explained them. What seemed unsolvable in 1959 was not unsolvable in principle. It was unsolvable with the tools available at the time. That distinction is one of the most important lessons in the file. Investigators in the original era had seen many of the right things: the controlled scene, the importance of the route, the possibility that the offender was not local, the need to preserve evidence. What they lacked was not intelligence, it was a future technology. And now, many years later, that technology was finally catching up to their instincts. When the reference samples from Cain's biological relatives were obtained and analyzed, they provided the direct comparison investigators had been working toward. This was the step that moved the case from strong suspicion into official confidence. The exact statistical language would have belonged to reports and forensic summaries. But the practical meaning was clear. The unknown DNA from the Walker case was consistent with coming from William Lowell Kane's immediate family line in the way investigators would expect if he were the source. That does not sound dramatic. It sounds measured, and measured is exactly what it needed to be. After 41 years, the case could not be solved responsibly by excitement. It had to be solved by restraint. The relative testing supported the genealogical reconstruction. The genealogical reconstruction supported the focus on Kane, and Kane's documented life gave detectives a plausible offender whose history fit far better than coincidence could explain. This was the moment when the file, after so many years of holding only questions, could finally hold a name with confidence. William Lowell Kane, a suspect long dead, a man never interviewed for the Walker murders in the way later investigators might have wished. A man who would never stand in a courtroom for what detectives now believed he had done. That limitation shaped the nature of the resolution. There would be no trial, no plea, no cross-examination, no sentence pronounced at the end of a formal proceeding. The justice available in this case was narrower, but still real. It was the justice of identification, the justice of saying, after all this time, the unknown man is unknown no longer. That did not happen in isolation. By the time officials reached the point of public announcement, they had to prepare carefully. A case solved through modern genealogy and relative DNA requires explanation. The public needs to understand that this was not guesswork from an online family tree. It was an investigation. Records were checked, evidence was tested, the science was reviewed, the suspect's history was examined. And the conclusion rested on more than any one element alone. You can imagine investigators and prosecutors, or agency leaders, reviewing how to speak about the case. What language should be used? How definitive should the statement be? What can be said responsibly when the suspect is dead and cannot be prosecuted? These are not only legal questions, they are ethical ones. Officials owe accuracy both to the victims and to the public. They also owe clarity. In old cases, the announcement itself becomes part of the historical record. The Walker file had spent decades as one of Florida's most haunting unsolved family murders. Now it would be recategorized, not forgotten, not diminished, but changed from unsolved to identified. That difference matters deeply in the world of cold cases. An unsolved case leaves the central question open. An identified offender, even one beyond prosecution, closes that central question while leaving some surrounding mysteries in place. And there were still surrounding mysteries here, exactly when Kane first noticed the family, whether he encountered them along their route or in Florida, how he selected them, what specific path took him from interest to action. Those details may never be known fully, but the core fact of who did it was no longer drifting. The public identification of Kane also reshaped how earlier evidence was understood. The travel theory, once broad and difficult to prove, now seemed stronger in hindsight. A drifter or transient offender had always been a possibility. Now the file contained a man whose life fit that possibility. The careful condition of the scene no longer floated without an owner. It attached to a person whose criminal history suggested calculation and danger. Even the long silence in the case looked different. It was no longer evidence that the early detectives had missed something obvious nearby. It was evidence that the offender had managed to remain outside the practical reach of the tools available at the time. That perspective can be comforting in a limited way. Not because it lessens the loss, but because it honors the original investigation without pretending it was all-powerful. When officials announced the breakthrough, the story naturally drew national attention. Cases solved after 4 decades do that. But beneath the headlines, the achievement was built from very unglamorous things. Evidence preserved correctly, records stored and retrievable, laboratory science developed over generations. Genealogical researchers willing to spend long hours building family trees from fragments. Detectives patient enough to re-enter an old case without arrogance. None of that makes for a fast montage. What it makes instead is something quieter: a chain of custody, a family tree, a lab report, a decision to check one more old record before speaking aloud. And in a case like this, that quiet chain is the whole story. Once investigators were ready to identify William Lowell Kane publicly, they also had to decide how much of the path to share. That matters in old cases. People do not only want to know who was found, they want to know how certainty was built after so many years of uncertainty. So officials explained that the answer had not come from a confession or a witness suddenly remembering a face. It came from preserved evidence, modern DNA testing, and genealogical work that pointed toward Cain and then had to be confirmed through his relatives. That sequence is important because each step depended on the one before it. If the original evidence had not survived, there would have been no usable profile. If the profile had been too limited, genealogy might not have been possible. If genealogy had pointed to a family but investigators stopped there, the case would have remained suggestive rather than settled. And if the family line testing had not supported the lead, Cain's name would have fallen away like so many others before him, but it did support the lead. So the file, which had once held an unknown offender in the most literal way, now held a man with a birth name, a criminal history, and a place in a documented family line. That changed the emotional shape of the case. An unknown person can feel almost abstract, even in a terrible crime. A named person does not. A named person belongs to time. He was born in a particular place. He moved through particular acts. He left a paper trail, however broken. And because he left that trail, investigators could begin reading the old Walker evidence alongside the known facts of his life. They looked at Cain not simply as a suspect produced by science, but as a person whose documented past gave weight to the identification. He had committed violent crimes before. He was not a respectable stranger accidentally connected through distant DNA. He was a man whose history already showed predatory behavior. That did not answer every question. It did, however, reduce the space for doubt. The Walker murders had always seemed to point towards someone capable of control, someone willing to enter and leave without leaving behind an obvious relationship to the family. Cain fit that general shape. And once he fitted biologically as well, the pieces no longer sat apart from one another. They began to lock. There is a difference between a theory that explains a crime and a person who embodies that theory. For decades, detectives had the first kind. By the end of the genealogical and relative DNA work, they had the second. You can imagine what that must have felt like for investigators who had spent years with the file. Not excitement in the ordinary sense, probably something slower. Relief, perhaps, mixed with caution. The kind of feeling that comes when a door opens, but only after you have checked the key 3 times. Because even then, even with strong support, cold case detectives are careful. They know that public identification is serious. It becomes part of the case forever. So they would have reviewed the evidence again. The original scene, the preserved biological material, the lab conclusions, the genealogical narrowing, the comparison with Cain's relatives, the timeline of his life, his known crimes, his possible movement, the fit between the old investigative instincts and the new scientific result. All of it had to be seen together. Only then could the case be said to have crossed over from mystery to answer. Even so, the answer had boundaries. A solved case after 41 years is not the same thing as a solved case after 4 months. Time takes things with it. It takes witnesses. It takes exact dates from memory. It takes the possibility of direct challenge and response. And in this case, it had also taken the suspect himself. Cain had died years earlier. That meant the law could not do what it normally does after identification. There could be no arrest, no indictment that moved toward trial, no courtroom testimony from the man at the center of the accusation, no chance to ask him why. That last absence is often the hardest one. When a case is cleared by identifying a dead suspect, the question of motive often remains partly open, even when the identity itself is strong. Investigators can infer, they can compare behavior, they can look at prior crimes and known patterns. But unless the suspect left some statement behind, or unless there is an overlooked witness who can place the interaction in detail, the interior reason may remain private forever. In the Walker case, some things could now be said with confidence. William Lowell Kane was identified as the likely killer. His family line matched the DNA path. His history supported the conclusion that he was capable of such a crime. His life fit the long-held view that the offender may have been a transient or drifter rather than a local intimate of the family. But the exact moment he first noticed the Walkers remained harder to name. Was it along the route south, at a stop during their religious work, somewhere in Florida after they arrived, or through some passing observation no one ever recognized as important? That uncertainty stayed in the file. And perhaps it always will. Yet old cases do not need every detail to recover their center. Sometimes the central act of justice is much simpler. It is to restore the missing noun. Not an unknown male, not an unidentified offender, but William Lowell Kane. That is what the investigation finally gave back. And once that happened, the way officials spoke about the case changed. The language of possibility gave way to the language of conclusion. Careful conclusion, yes, but conclusion nonetheless. The Walkers were no longer waiting inside a file marked unsolved. Their case had moved into another category. For the sheriff's office, and for the cold case investigators involved, that mattered institutionally as well as emotionally. An agency carries its unsolved cases in a particular way. Some become symbols of what remains unfinished. When one of those files is finally cleared, it is not triumph exactly. It is more like a burden being set down carefully. Not forgotten, not erased, set down. You can see why the announcement would have mattered deeply to those who had worked on it. Many of them were not the original deputies. They were the inheritors of old decisions. People who had opened drawers filled by others. People who had to trust that the evidence was what the labels said it was. People who had to bridge their own era of forensic science with an earlier era of handwritten reports and analog habits. When a case like that resolves, it is not only a credit to the people who solved it late, it is also a quiet acknowledgement of the people who preserved it early. This is why the Walker case often stands as an example of patient detective work more than dramatic detective work. The early investigators did not have the answer, but they kept the possibility of an answer alive. Later investigators did not witness the crime and could not recreate 1959, but they knew how to ask the evidence better questions. And the genealogists did not replace police work. They extended it. They took the profile produced by the laboratory and moved it through generations until a specific human life came into view. Each group did a different kind of labor. Together, those labors met in one place. That place was the name. There is also another dimension here, one that matters in almost every old case solved by modern DNA. The suspect's relatives become part of the final chapter, whether they wanted to or not. Not because they did anything wrong, not because they share any blame, but because biology is relational. The truth about one person can arrive through the bodies of others. That can be strange to sit with. A daughter, a sibling, a cousin, a more distant relation, each simply living an ordinary life, may become part of a historical investigation because inherited patterns connect them to someone who harmed others long ago. So, when detectives obtain reference samples or reconstruct family trees, there is a human delicacy to the process. This is not only evidence gathering. It is also contact with people whose family story is changing in front of them. Some relatives may have known that Kane had a criminal past. Some may have known very little. Some may have been gone by the time the inquiry reached them. Some may have cooperated with a sense of duty or confusion, or both. Those private reactions are usually not the center of public reporting, and perhaps that is for the best. But they are part of the human reality of how these cases resolve. The dead do not answer alone. The living help identify them. And that means the final resolution in a case like the Walkers belongs partly to people who never asked to be involved in it. At the same time, the surviving family and community connected to the victims experience a different kind of delayed reckoning. 41 years is long enough for generations to overlap. Children become adults. Adults become grandparents. Investigators retire. Newspaper files yellow. Streets change. Houses are altered or replaced. A case that began in one cultural world is solved in another. So the meaning of resolution also changes. No, one could give Cliff, Christine, Jimmy, and Debbie back. No announcement could recreate the life the community would have known if the crime had never happened. And after so many years, no courtroom could create the full public accounting that might have existed in the early 1960s. What remained possible was narrower, but still meaningful. The case could be named as solved by identification. The family could be spoken of not as victims of an eternal unknown, but as victims of a known man. And the long suspicion that the answer might still be hidden in the evidence could be proven right. That matters more than it first appears. An unsolved case is not only a crime without a name attached, it is also an argument against forgetting. To keep working such a file is to insist that the passage of years does not cancel obligation. The Walker case shows what that insistence can accomplish. For decades, it would have been easy to say the answer was probably lost. The route was too broad. The witnesses were too old. The suspect was too mobile, too hidden, too dead. And yet the material was there, not enough to solve it in 1959, enough to solve it later. The difference between those two conditions is almost the whole history of forensic cold case work in the modern era. As more people learned about the identification of Cain, the case naturally drew comparison to other old mysteries solved through preserved evidence. But the Walker file had its own character. It involved a family. It involved an itinerant religious life that widened the suspect pool from the start. It involved a very early investigation that had to think in terms of roads, not just rooms. And it involved a region that carried the memory of the crime for decades. That memory had always rested on the unanswered nature of the case. Now the memory had to adjust. The story was no longer only one of loss and silence. It was also one of eventual recognition. There is a practical side to that change too. When a case is cleared by identification, agencies can explain to the public what remains unknown and what does not. That distinction protects the history from becoming exaggerated. Investigators could now say, with strong support, who the offender was. They could also acknowledge what remained uncertain about his exact path into the Walkers' lives. That balance matters. It keeps the file honest. Old mysteries invite overstatement once they are solved. People want the final chapter to be complete, to close every gap neatly. Real investigations rarely do that. The Walker case did not. What it offered instead was something steadier. It answered the largest question and left some of the smaller ones respectfully unresolved. For the detectives and researchers involved, that may have felt oddly fitting. This had never been a case of sudden clarity. Why should its ending pretend to be one? The answer came in the same spirit the case had always required. Patient, layered, and a little incomplete around the edges. And perhaps that incompleteness is worth sitting with. Because even when science works beautifully, even when records survive, even when family trees point in the right direction, a human life remains more complex than the file that describes it. William Lowell Cain could be identified as the likely killer. His past could be outlined, his crimes could be listed, his family line could be mapped. But the private movement of his mind on the days that mattered most remains partly sealed. There is no lab test for that. There is no genealogical chart for motive in its most intimate sense. So the case resolves, but not theatrically. It resolves the way many old cases do, with confidence where confidence is earned, with silence where silence cannot be broken. That kind of resolution also teaches something about how investigators think when they return to old files. They do not always expect perfection. Often they are working towards something more modest, but still profound. Can the unknown be reduced? Can the victims be named in relation to a real person, not a blank? Can the agency say honestly that it carried its duty as far as the evidence would allow? In the Walker case, the answer to those questions became yes, and that yes depended on a remarkable continuity across time. The deputies, in late December of 1959, could not know the language of forensic genealogy. The lab analysts, decades later, could not interview the earliest witnesses while memory was fresh. The genealogists could not create a profile if the physical material had been lost. The final investigators could not speak publicly if the biological confirmation through Cain's relatives had failed. Each moment depended on another moment, often separated by many years. That is why the solution to the Walker case feels less like a single breakthrough than like a bridge finally completed from both sides. One side began at the crime scene, the other began in the laboratory age. And in the middle were all the years of storage, review, and refusal to discard what seemed unreadable. If you step back from the details for a moment, that is what makes the case quietly extraordinary. Not only that it was solved, but that it was solved because so many ordinary duties were performed well enough to survive time. Evidence was boxed, reports were written, names were preserved, a file remained open in spirit, even when it could not yet move in practice. Then, when the science arrived, people were ready to use it. There is also a lesson here about the old idea of the perfect suspect. For many years, investigators probably imagined someone in outline only, a male offender, likely transient, likely opportunistic, capable of entering a stranger's life briefly and doing irreversible harm. That is a behavioral sketch, not a person. When Cain emerged, he did not answer every behavioral question with exact precision. Few suspects do. But he answered enough, and in the most important ways. He was not local in the ordinary neighborhood sense. He had a violent background, he fit the age and sex requirements, he fit the biological evidence, and his life matched the long suspicion that the Walkers may have crossed paths with a dangerous man outside their circle of trust. That fit strengthened another subtle point. The original investigators had not been wrong to widen the case beyond Osprey. That was one of the earliest strategic choices in the file. It cost time. It made the inquiry more difficult. It multiplied leads. But it was also conceptually sound. The house was the final site, not necessarily the first point of contact. Later science did not erase that logic. It supported it. And when modern results validate an old investigative instinct, there is something almost generous about that. The past is not corrected so much as completed. Of course, once the identity of Cain became public, people naturally asked what else was known about him. Where had he lived? What crimes had he committed? What kind of life had he led after the Walker murders? Those are understandable questions, though they must be handled carefully. A suspect's biography can illuminate a case, but it can also tempt storytellers towards sensational framing. The quieter truth is usually enough. Cain's record showed serious violence. He had committed crimes that demonstrated both danger and instability. He was the sort of man for whom the Walker murders did not appear out of character in the broadest moral sense. That context is important. It helps explain why investigators felt comfortable attaching his name to the case publicly, even though there would be no trial. They were not relying on genetics alone in a vacuum. They were relying on genetics placed alongside a life already marked by grave criminal conduct. Still, no careful investigator would claim more than the file can support. There were questions that could be inferred, but not sealed shut. Did Cain follow the family from an earlier stop? Did he notice them because of their work distributing religious literature? Did he see them as vulnerable because they were traveling and temporarily rooted? Did he act alone? The evidence strongly pointed to his identity. On finer-grained motive and sequence, restraint remained necessary. That restraint is not weakness, it is respect for the difference between evidence and imagination. And in a story like this, respect matters. It matters because the victims deserve more than a dramatic ending. They deserve accuracy. The Walkers had lived in a way that left warm impressions on many people. Cliff's ministry work, Christine's steadiness, the visible presence of the children, These were remembered not because the case was famous, but because the family themselves were memorable. When a case lasts 41 years, those remembered qualities can flatten into symbols if no one is careful. The minister, the wife, the children. But they were not categories. They were four people with a routine, a purpose, a trip south, and a future that stopped abruptly. Part of what resolution does, even delayed resolution, is return a little of that stolen specificity. Once the killer is named, the victims can step slightly out of the shadow of abstraction. They no longer exist only inside a mystery. They exist inside a history with an identified offender. That does not restore everything. It does change the moral arrangement of the story. For the community, that may have brought a kind of late exhale. Not celebration, something gentler than that. The lifting of one old uncertainty. Communities carry unsolved family cases in a particular way. There is often no daily conversation about them after the first years. Life continues. Businesses open and close, roads are repaved, people move. But the case sits in memory as an unfinished sentence. You may only think of it occasionally. Then a news report appears decades later, and suddenly the sentence gains its missing verb. In Osprey and beyond, that was likely part of the reaction. Not shock exactly, because the crime itself had long been known. Not surprised that science could help, because by then other cold cases had shown the way. Rather, a sober recognition that this one, after all those years, had finally yielded. And once a case yields, attention often turns to the detectives who stayed with it. That attention can be misleading if it turns them into heroes of a dramatic type. Most cold case work is stubbornly procedural. The people involved are often most proud not of insight alone, but of process. Did they protect the evidence? Did they revisit assumptions? Did they understand the limits of genealogy? Did they corroborate before announcing? Did they build a conclusion that was careful enough to outlast scrutiny? In the Walker investigation, that procedural pride would have been justified. The case was not solved by a leap. It was solved by stages. Each stage reduced the space for error. The original evidence narrowed the type of offender. The preserved biological material created a profile. The profile allowed genealogical searching. The family tree narrowed toward Cain. The relative's DNA supported the biological link. Cain's history and life pattern made him a plausible and compelling match. Only then did public identification follow. This sequence also helps explain why old, cold cases are so often solved by teams rather than single personalities. No one person possesses all the necessary time periods or skills. The deputy at the scene knows the house. The cold case detective knows the file. The lab analyst knows the sample. The genealogist knows the family branches. The prosecutor or agency leader knows what can be stated responsibly. And because each of those people sees only one part at a time, the final act of solving an old case is often an act of assembly. You take the house, the file, the sample, the family tree, the criminal history, and you see whether they still align when placed beside each other in full. In the Walker case, they did. That is why the announcement, when it came, carried a certain calm authority. It was not offered as a theory in search of applause. It was offered as the result of decades of preservation, years of renewed review, and a chain of evidence that had finally become strong enough to bear a name. For the officials involved, that distinction mattered. An old case can gather legends around itself. People fill silence with ideas. A community repeats what it thinks it remembers. Reporters inherit fragments from earlier reporters. And over time, the mystery can become larger than the evidence. So when a cold case is finally cleared, responsible investigators often do something very grounded. They bring the story back down to what can be demonstrated. In this case, that meant saying, carefully, that William Lowell Cain had been identified as the likely killer. Not because one clue suddenly shone brighter than all the others, but because many smaller things, preserved across many years, now pointed in the same direction. There is a plainness to that kind of resolution, and the plainness is part of its strength. You do not have to force the facts to sound dramatic. The facts have already done their work. A preserved sample, a DNA profile, distant relatives, a family tree narrowed branch by branch, reference samples from close biological kin, then the comparison, then the confidence to speak. When you lay it out like that, the Walker case begins to look almost like a study in time itself. The crime belonged to one era, the solution belonged to another, and between them sat all the ordinary acts that allowed one era to speak to the next. A deputy sealing evidence, a clerk recording property, a detective keeping notes legible, a file not being thrown away when office space grew tight, a later investigator deciding that an old item should be tested rather than merely stored. These acts are not usually celebrated in the moment, but without them, the later announcement could never happen. By the time the case was identified publicly, there was another truth to face as well. The story had changed categories, but it had not become simple. Knowing who most likely killed the Walker family did not explain every movement of his life. It did not tell investigators where he slept on the night before, or what route he took afterward in exact detail. It did not reveal a written confession hidden in some trunk, or a witness who could now narrate every step. What it did provide was the center, and in cold case work, the center matters more than completeness. The center is the point around which the rest can be understood honestly. Without a center, every theory floats. With one, even unanswered details begin to settle into a more truthful shape. That is what happened here. Once Cain was identified, earlier questions could be revisited with better balance. Why had no obvious local suspect emerged in Osprey? Because the killer may never have been rooted there in any meaningful way. Why had the route south mattered so much? Because the family's exposure to strangers during travel and religious work may well have been where danger first entered the story. Why had the file resisted ordinary suspect-based investigation for so long? Because the right man was likely never sitting in the original circle of known local contacts at all. This kind of retrospective understanding does not rewrite the case. It clarifies it, and clarification can feel like its own kind of peace. Not a complete peace, not the peace of forgetting, something quieter than that. A file that once held too many open possibilities, now holding fewer. A question once asked in every direction, now finally answered in one. There is also the matter of how institutions describe success in a case where prosecution is impossible. That wording can seem technical from the outside, but it carries emotional weight. A living suspect can be arrested, charged, brought before a court. A dead suspect cannot. So, agencies often speak of a case being cleared by identification, or solved through identification, rather than closed in the full courtroom sense. This is not a lesser truth. It is simply the truth available in the circumstances. And in the Walker case, that truth was significant. For more than 4 decades, the offender had no public name attached to him with confidence. Then he did. That change affects not only records, but memory. It changes how the case is taught, how it is archived, how it is recalled by those who lived near it, and how future investigators understand the value of the work that preserved it. You might think of an old case file as a room with one light out. People can still move around inside it, they can still describe the walls, they can still identify the furniture, but one important corner remains dim. When the central identification arrives, it does not flood the room with brightness. It simply turns on that one missing light, and suddenly the shape of everything else makes more sense. The Walker case became that kind of room. William Lowell Cain's name did not answer every remaining question, but it illuminated enough that the old uncertainty no longer dominated the whole space. As often happens after a breakthrough, people also began to look more closely at Cain himself, not to turn him into a figure of fascination, but to understand how he fit so long unanswered suspicions. His criminal record mattered here in a practical way. Investigators were not naming a person who had lived an ordinary life untouched by violence. They were naming a man already known, in official records, for grave and predatory conduct. That gave context to the identification. It helped explain why the biological evidence once linked to him felt consistent with the moral outline of the case. Again, that does not mean biography replaces proof. It does not. But when DNA, genealogy, and background all support one another, the conclusion becomes harder to dismiss as coincidence or overreach. For cold case detectives, that coherence is essential. They do not want a name that merely fits. They want a name that holds, a name that remains strong when tested against every old report they can still read, a name that makes sense of the evidence instead of forcing the evidence to serve it. By the time Kane's identity was announced, the file had reached that point. And still, some of the most thoughtful people connected to the case likely understood that resolution after 41 years carries a different emotional tone than a quick arrest. There is no burst of courtroom activity, no daily updates, no jury selection, no verdict after tense waiting. Instead, there is a press conference, or an official statement, or a sheriff's announcement. And behind it, a very long corridor of time. You stand at the far end of that corridor and look back. 1959. The original deputies, the shell casings, the interviews, the road south from Illinois, the unanswered decades, the boxed evidence, the new testing, the family tree, the relatives' samples, the final comparison, then the name. It is less like a dramatic finish than like a clock finally striking after years of silence. For the surviving people connected to the Walkers, the meaning of that moment would have been personal in ways outsiders can only approximate. Some may have spent years expecting no answer at all. Others may have hoped quietly, without saying much, that one day science would return to the case. Some may have lived long enough to hear the identification. Some may not. That is one of the sorrows built into old cases. Time does not only age the file, it ages everyone waiting around it. And so a breakthrough, even when welcome, can arrive carrying both relief and grief together. Relief that the unknown is no longer unknown. Grief that the answer came so late, after so many lives had already moved on or ended. There is no way around that doubleness. It belongs to nearly every cold case solved after generations have passed. But there is something steadying in the fact that the answer came at all, because many old cases never reach even this point. The evidence degrades too badly, the records disappear, the profile cannot be developed, the relatives cannot be found, or the tree never narrows enough to move beyond possibility. The Walker case did not fall into that silence. It crossed over. And once it crossed over, it offered lessons broader than itself. One lesson was about storage, another about review, another about resisting the temptation to assume that old evidence has already said all it can say, and another, perhaps the quietest lesson, was about humility. Investigators in one generation do not always solve the cases they inherit. Sometimes their work is to preserve the file honestly for people they will never meet. That kind of humility rarely makes headlines, yet it is one of the deepest forms of professional care in law enforcement. You work not only for today, but for a future method you cannot yet describe. That is what happened here. The people in 1959 did not know forensic genealogy was coming. They did not know that biological material, if kept correctly, might one day identify a man through distant cousins and careful record building. They only knew that evidence mattered, that reports mattered, that details should be written down and not trusted entirely to memory. They were right. The future proved them right. As the case moved from unsolved to identified, another important shift began to happen in how the Walker family themselves were discussed. For years, public attention had naturally centered on the mystery: who did it? How could an entire family be harmed without an answer for so long? Why had no suspect ever been charged? These are valid questions, but they can flatten the people at the center of the case into symbols of an enigma. Once the offender had a name, there was room to speak a little more plainly about the family as they had lived. Cliff Walker was not only a victim in an old file, he was a father, a husband, a man whose work involved carrying religious literature and speaking with people in trust. Christine was not only a name listed beside his. She was a mother, a partner in that traveling life, remembered for steadiness and warmth. Jimmy and Debbie were not only the children in a famous cold case. There were two young lives folded into that journey south, two children whose presence shaped the memory of the case for everyone who heard it. This return to personhood matters. Solving a case is not only about naming the offender, it is also about restoring the victims from abstraction. And that restoration is often gentler in old cases than in fresh ones. Time has worn away some of the noise. What remains are the names, the photographs, the recollections, the fact of a family that should have had more years than it was given. There is another reason the Walker case remains so powerful in memory. It joined two things that communities rarely forget. The first was the vulnerability of ordinary domestic life. A modest house, evening light, familiar rooms, a neighborhood that did not expect to become part of a historic investigation. The second was the family's visible goodness, their travel for religious work, their openness, their willingness to meet people without suspicion. When those two things combine, a case settles differently in public memory. People do not only remember the crime, they remember the wrongness of trust being met by danger. And because that wrongness feels so plain, the absence of an answer can linger for decades. This is why the eventual identification of Cain had meaning beyond procedure. It did not erase the wrongness, but it answered the question of where, in human terms, that wrongness had come from. Not from some eternal shadow, not from a faceless rumor, from one man. That narrowing matters morally. It returns responsibility to a person instead of leaving it suspended in mystery. Of course, even with the identification, some parts of Cain's connection to the family remained uncertain. Investigators could infer likely paths. They could compare his known behavior to the family's route and visibility. They could consider whether he noticed them during travel, or after they arrived in Florida, or through some interaction no witness ever fully recognized. But inference has limits. A responsible file keeps those limits in view. The danger in any solved old case is that once the central name is known, people begin to write the missing details too confidently. The Walker case asks for a more careful approach. It invites you to stay close to what the evidence can hold. Cain was identified through modern DNA and genealogical work. His life and criminal history made him a compelling and plausible offender. His identity fit the broad theories investigators had long entertained. Beyond that, some spaces remain. And those spaces are not failures. They are simply the edges of what time permits. For cold case teams, accepting those edges is part of the discipline. You do not have to know everything to know the most important thing. That idea is sometimes hard for the public because mystery stories often promise total closure. Real cases are less generous. They offer partial restoration, a name, a sequence, a likely path, a stronger understanding of what happened than existed before. Then they stop. And if we are careful, we let them stop there. In the Walker case, the identification also confirmed something else of quiet importance. It showed that modern cold case work is not merely a search for better machines, it is a search for better questions. Once the DNA profile existed, investigators did not simply ask, whose profile is this? They asked, if there is no direct match, what family line does this belong to? If this family line contains many men, which of them fit the time and place? If one man begins to fit more than the others, what records can support that fit? And if records support it, how do we test the family line directly? Each question was more refined than the last. Each reduced uncertainty. That ladder of questioning is what gave the case its eventual solidity. And it reminds you that science alone does not solve old mysteries. People do. Science gives them new leverage. But the work remains human, reading old files, locating relatives, weighing probabilities, resisting haste, and knowing when the evidence has finally become strong enough to speak. By then, the Walker case had become an example often cited whenever people discussed what could happen when preservation, forensic development, and genealogical patience meet in the same file, not because it was flashy, but because it illustrated the entire arc so clearly. An old crime scene from the late 1950s, a long unresolved interval, a preserved biological trace, a modern profile, a genealogical search through relatives, a suspect who had died before he could be confronted. a public identification grounded in evidence rather than drama. There is something almost textbook about that sequence now. But it was not textbook while it was happening. It was uncertain, fragile, and dependent on people making good decisions at each step. If one box had been misplaced, if one item had been discarded, if one chain of custody record had failed, if one later review had concluded the evidence was too old to bother testing, the ending might have been different, or there might have been no ending at all. That fragility should stay with us when we think about the case. It keeps us from treating the solution as inevitable. It was not inevitable. It was earned. Earned by the first investigation's care. Earned by later generations refusing to let the case become only a legend. Earned by the analysts and genealogists who gave long attention to details too small to impress anyone outside the work. And earned, too, by the victims, whose names were never allowed to dissolve into mere file numbers. As this new understanding settled in, officials and observers alike had to face one final contrast. The answer was strong. The accountability was limited. That is the shape of many late-solved cases. You can identify the offender with confidence and still never see a courtroom. You can know and still not punish. For some people, that feels incomplete. It is incomplete. But incompleteness is not the same as emptiness. A courtroom is one form of justice. Identification is another. Public truth is another. Historical correction is another. The Walker case could not receive the first. It did receive the others, and sometimes, after enough years have passed, those forms matter more than people expect. To know that the file was not abandoned in vain, to know that the old suspicions about a non-local mobile offender were not simply guesswork, to know that the evidence had indeed preserved a path to the killer, to know that the names Cliff, Christine, Jimmy, and Debbie no longer sit under a heading marked Unknown Assailant. These are not small things. They are the practical substance of what resolution looks like when time has removed almost everything else. You can imagine the file room after an announcement like that. The same drawers, the same folders, the same old reports with worn edges. Only one line changes, and that line changes the meaning of every page. A suspect field that once remained blank now contains a name. An unsolved classification becomes a solved by identification classification. Nothing physical in the room transforms very much, but the history inside it does. That quiet administrative shift may be one of the truest images of old case resolution. No trumpet, no chase, just a record updated because patient work finally reached the threshold of certainty. For the investigators who had lived with the case, that would have been enough to feel profound. And once that threshold had been crossed, the next, gentler question emerged. What does it mean for a case to be resolved after so much life has passed around it? The answer is not exactly the same for everyone. For law enforcement, it may mean a duty completed as far as evidence allowed. For community memory, it may mean an old wound no longer carrying the same unanswered weight. For the victim's surviving circle, it may mean hearing at last the thing they had been denied for decades, a real name attached to the act. But for anyone studying the file carefully, it also means something else. It means seeing how much of justice can depend on acts that look, at the time, almost invisible. A property tag attached properly, a note written clearly, a photograph filed with the right date, a supervisor deciding not to clear out shelves too aggressively, a cold case detective opening one old box and treating its contents not as leftovers, but as unfinished conversation. That phrase fits the Walker case especially well, because this was, in a sense, a conversation between generations of investigators. The first generation asked the evidence what it could answer in 1959. The evidence answered only part of the question. The next generations preserved the question. Later science asked again. This time the evidence could say more. And because it could say more, the conversation changed from what happened here to who left this trace, to whose family line carries this signal, to which man in that line lived the kind of life that fits both the biology and the crime. That is a long conversation, 41 years long, Yet it remained coherent because enough people kept listening. There is also a quiet dignity in how the final answer did not require exaggeration. Investigators did not need to turn the case into something more ornate than it already was. They did not need to promise certainty where only likelihood could be claimed. They did not need to invent motive beyond what records and context could support. They could simply say that William Lowell Kane had been identified as the likely killer through preserved evidence, modern DNA testing, genealogical research, and confirmation through biological relatives. That sentence, spoken calmly, carries more weight than any dramatic retelling, because it rests on work. And work, in old mysteries, is what lasts. As the case settled into this new status, it also offered a larger reflection on how cold case justice tends to arrive. Not fast, not cleanly, not with all questions answered. It arrives in pieces. One piece from a property room, one from a lab bench, one from an obituary, one from a census record, one from a relative's DNA, one from a detective willing to compare old assumptions against new facts. By themselves, these pieces are modest. Together they become enough. That word matters here. Enough. Enough to identify. Enough to speak publicly. Enough, too, to let officials speak with the kind of care that old cases deserve. They could say more than they had ever been able to say before, but they still had to choose their words precisely. That precision mattered, because once a dead man is named in a murder case, the record hardens around him. There is no future trial to refine the public story, no defense attorney to test each point in court, no witness stand where every detail is pressed and compared under immediate pressure. So the standard had to be internal before it became public. Investigators had to ask themselves whether the evidence taken together would still hold if examined years later by people who knew nothing of the file except what the file itself could prove. That is one reason the announcement of Kane's identification carried a certain plainness. It was not offered as a sweeping theory of every unanswered detail. It was offered as a statement about identity, who the evidence pointed to, why that conclusion had been reached, and what remained outside certain knowledge. In practical terms, that meant the Walker case entered a rare category. It was no longer a mystery in the broad public sense, but neither was it the kind of solved case that closes with testimony and conviction. It sat somewhere quieter than that, identified, explained in its center, still partly shadowed at the edges. That distinction may seem small from a distance, but for cold case investigators, it means almost everything. It marks the difference between guessing responsibly and knowing responsibly. And once the name William Lowell Kane was attached to the file, the next stage of understanding began. People returned to the old reports and read them differently, not to change them, not to force them, simply to see whether old details made more sense now that the unknown man was no longer unknown. Some things did. The idea of a transient or drifter had always hovered over the case because of the family's travel and the lack of a strong local suspect. Kane fit that possibility far better than many of the names considered over the years. His life was not centered in one stable community where everyone would have known him. He was exactly the kind of man who might pass through the margins of memory, seen briefly, not remembered well, gone before suspicion settled. That fit gave the old root theory new strength. For decades, investigators had suspected that the Walkers may have been noticed before they arrived in Osprey. Now, there was a suspect whose background made that possibility feel less speculative. Still, even with that stronger frame, the file did not suddenly reveal every movement in perfect order. It never does. What it offered instead was a more believable shape. A family traveling openly, a dangerous man with a history of violence, an encounter, somewhere, that moved from chance into intent. Then the house in Osprey. Then 41 years of silence before science finally made the hidden connection visible. That shape was enough to clarify the case without pretending to complete it. And for those who study old investigations, that kind of clarification is deeply valuable. It protects the case from myth. It keeps the public story tied to the evidence. It lets memory rest on something firmer than rumor. There is another part of this that matters just as much. Once Cain was identified, the work of explaining the result became almost as important as the result itself. Cold case breakthroughs can sound magical when summarized too quickly. A sample is tested, a family tree appears, a name emerges. But in truth, each of those steps contains a dozen smaller decisions. Which sample was usable? How was contamination ruled out? What genealogical matches were strong enough to pursue? Which branches were eliminated? And why? How were relatives located? What kind of comparison showed the relationship to Cain's line? Those details are not dramatic, but they are the bones of credibility. Without them, the public gets a story. With them, the public gets an investigation. So law enforcement had to make the path understandable. Not every laboratory detail needed to be recited. Not every internal memo needed to become public, but the broad sequence had to be clear enough that anyone listening could understand that this was not guesswork dressed up as modern science. It was method. Preserved evidence created the opportunity. DNA analysis created the profile. Genealogy created a narrowed family line. Traditional records work created an emerging suspect. Relative testing created confirmation, and only after those steps aligned was Cain named. That order matters. It shows restraint. It also shows something else. The final answer belonged to no single error. The first generation of investigators preserved the evidence. Later generations preserved the file. Modern specialists supplied the scientific and genealogical tools. The identification was a joint act across time. That is one of the most human things about the Walker case. No one solved it alone. Not the deputies in 1959. Not the detectives decades later. Not the analysts. Not the genealogists. The answer came because each group carried the case a little farther than the one before. And once that answer existed, the Walker family could be discussed differently. For years, the case had often been framed around the mystery itself. A family slain, no arrest, no obvious suspect, a file that outlived decades. That framing is understandable. But it tends to make the victims serve the mystery. After the identification, there was room to reverse that. Now the mystery served the people again. Cliff Walker could be remembered not only as a central name in a cold case, but as a traveling minister and father whose work brought him into many brief human encounters. Christine could be remembered not simply as part of a tragic file, but as the person whose steadiness and warmth still surfaced in later recollections. Jimmy and Debbie could be remembered as children whose names had traveled through the decades because the public never quite forgot them. This does not solve grief. It does not erase the violence that ended their lives, but it does restore proportion. The case becomes about a family first, and only then about the man who harmed them. That shift, quiet as it is, may be one of the deepest forms of late justice, because unresolved cases tend to trap victims inside uncertainty. They become examples, symbols, shorthand for a puzzle. Once the puzzle's center is answered, even partly, the victims are less burdened by the role of permanent mystery. They can simply be people again. Of course, the naming of Cain also invites a difficult question. What does resolution really mean when the offender has been dead for years? There is no single answer. For some, it means the truth has at last become public. For others, it means the state has done what it still could, even if punishment was no longer available. For investigators, it may mean one old obligation has finally been carried to its proper end. And for the surviving circles around the Walkers, it may mean that a long, unfinished sentence has at last found its subject. Still, resolution in a case like this is never total. The suspect cannot explain himself. No confession exists to reveal motive in his own words. No trial can establish the story in public through witnesses and cross-examination. That absence creates a certain permanent quiet around the case. You know the name, you know the path to that name, you know enough to trust the identification. But there are chambers of the story that remain closed. How exactly Cain's attention fixed on the family, whether he first saw them on the road or nearer to Osprey? What detail, if any, turned them from strangers into targets in his mind? Those things may never be known, and careful investigators resist the temptation to decorate that silence. They leave it as silence. That restraint is one reason the Walker case remains instructive. It shows how to accept a powerful answer without pretending it is an absolute one. And that in turn says something important about cold casework more broadly. A reopened file is not a machine for creating perfection. It is an attempt to recover what can still be recovered. Sometimes that is a fingerprint, sometimes a name from a notebook, sometimes a witness who speaks late, and sometimes, as here, it is a DNA path leading through family lines to one long dead suspect. The standard is not completeness, the standard is honesty. What do we know? How do we know it? What remains uncertain in the Walker case, those questions could now be answered with far more confidence than ever before. That confidence also changed how the old delays were understood. For years, the absence of an arrest might have looked, from outside, like failure without explanation. But once Kane's identity came into focus, the decades of uncertainty looked less like neglect and more like limitation. The offender had likely remained outside the obvious circles of early suspicion. He was not someone whose name would naturally arise from neighborhood interviews alone. He was not someone who left behind an easy personal connection for detectives to follow in 1959. The original investigators had widened the search, and in that sense their instincts had been sound. What they lacked was the one bridge modern investigators eventually built, a biological bridge from trace evidence to a named family line. Seen that way, the case becomes almost a study in the difference between insight and capability. The early detectives understood important aspects of the crime. The later detectives had tools the early ones did not. Neither group was enough by itself. Together, they were. That is a generous way to read the file, and also a fair one. It allows credit to be shared properly. The people in the beginning did not fail simply because they could not do what their century had not yet invented. The people at the end did not conjure an answer from nowhere. They inherited preserved work and finally gave it a new language. This is why the Walker case remains so compelling to anyone interested in patient detective work. It is not a story of brilliance arriving all at once. It is a story of continuity. One set of hands collects, another stores, another reviews, another tests, another compares, another announces. The answer belongs to all of them, and perhaps that is why the final result feels solemn rather than triumphant. There is no scene of confrontation, no final interview in a fluorescent room, no moment when Kane is shown the evidence and forced to answer. He never heard the conclusion that now bears his name. He never sat across from the detectives who finally reached him through science. He remained, in that sense, outside the process to the very end. But his absence does not undo the force of the identification. If anything, it makes the discipline behind it even more important. When a suspect is alive, investigators can test their theory in one more way, through questioning, reaction, contradiction, or confession. When a suspect is dead, the evidence must stand alone. So, in the Walker case, every link had to be strong enough to bear that solitude. And by the time authorities spoke publicly, they believed it was. That belief rested not only on laboratory probability, but on contextual fit. Kane's criminal history mattered here in a very grounded way. He was not merely a man whose relatives matched a family tree. He was a man whose record showed violence and predation. His life made the accusation intelligible. Again, that does not mean biography proves guilt. It means the biological identification did not land on a life that made no sense of it. It landed on a life already marked by serious criminal conduct. That coherence gave investigators confidence that they were not misreading a genetic coincidence. And once the public understood that, the case settled into a new kind of memory. No longer one of Florida's enduring unknowns, now one of its late answered files. That change may sound administrative, but it carries emotional weight. Unsolved cases stay open in the imagination. They invite endless substitution. Anyone can become the imagined offender. Every new theory can seem plausible for a time, but once an offender is identified with evidentiary support, imagination loses some of its power. The story becomes narrower, and in narrowing, truer. That truth also affects how future generations will encounter the case. Students of cold casework will not read it only as a haunting family murder from the late 1950s. They will read it as an example of what preserved evidence can accomplish when revisited with patience. They will see how a case can move from witness memory to physical evidence, from physical evidence to DNA, from DNA to genealogy, and from genealogy to one documented life. In that sense, the Walker file becomes almost instructional. It teaches the value of old paperwork. It teaches the value of not discarding evidence simply because current methods have exhausted it. It teaches that the question in a cold case is not only what can be done now, but what might be possible later if the material survives. Those are practical lessons. But there is a moral lesson too. The Walkers were not forgotten. Not fully. Not by the community, not by the agencies, not by the later detectives who reopened the file. That persistence matters, because memory is part of justice, not the whole of it. But a part. Cases that disappear entirely into storage are much harder to rescue. Cases that remain somewhere in the institutional conscience have a better chance. The Walker murders clearly remained there. You can feel it in the way the file was revisited across years. You can feel it in the willingness to inventory old evidence carefully. You can feel it in the eventual decision to spend time and resources on genealogy and relative testing. None of that happens unless a case still matters inside the people responsible for it. And it still mattered. There is also something almost paradoxical about the solution. For decades, the case widened. More roads, more possible encounters, more jurisdictions, more names. Then, in the final years, the solution narrowed through methods that were more intimate than anything the original investigators could have imagined. Not a broader dragnet, not a louder appeal. Instead, inherited DNA, distant cousins, family lines, old records of births and marriages, a biological whisper carried across generations. That is a remarkable contrast. The case that once sprawled across miles of highway was finally solved by tracing kinship. A journey outward was answered by a journey inward, and that inward method had its own demands. Genealogy is slow because families are slow. They branch, rename themselves, move, divide, and rejoin across decades. To find one man inside that network requires patience of a special kind. You cannot rush a family tree any more than you can rush a careful archive. You follow the records where they go. You correct mistakes. You test assumptions. You remove the wrong branch and continue. In the Walker case, that patient narrowing was what finally turned possibility into a person. And once it did, the whole file changed temperature. It cooled, in a sense. Not because the crime mattered less, because the uncertainty did. Questions that had once generated endless motion could now rest. Who was the unknown man? He had a name. Was the offender likely local? Probably not in the ordinary sense. Was the route into Florida important? Very likely yes. Did the preserved evidence matter? Absolutely. Could the old investigation still speak? Yes, if someone asked it the right modern questions. Those are significant shifts. They do not produce excitement so much as steadiness. The file becomes less haunted by speculation, more settled in fact. And yet, because the case involved a family and because the answer came so late, the emotional register never becomes simple. There is relief. But there is also the ache of delay. 41 years is not an abstract span. It is enough time for children to become older than their parents ever had the chance to be. Enough time for detectives to retire and die. Enough time for a town to change its roads, its houses, its habits of memory. The answer arrived inside that long passage of time, not outside it. So it carries time with it. Every press report, every official statement, Every retelling of the identification comes shadowed by the thought that this could not help the Walkers in their own era. It could only help the record. That may sound limited. It is limited. But records matter. Records are how societies remember truth. And for the Walker family, truth had waited too long already. By restoring a name to the offender, investigators changed the record permanently. That is not the same as changing the past. Nothing can do that. But it does change the shape of memory, and memory shapes what comes after. Future officers looking at the case will not see only frustration. They will see proof that persistence mattered. Future families waiting on other cold cases may look at it and understand that long silence does not always mean permanent silence. Future archivists and evidence custodians may look at it and understand that what seems dormant today may become decisive tomorrow. In that way, the Walker case reaches beyond itself. It becomes part of a larger argument for patience. Still, even as the file moved into this new category, there remained the quieter task of framing what had happened without overstating it. Officials could say that William Lowell Kane was identified as the likely killer. They could say the identification rested on DNA, genealogy, and relative comparison. They could say his background supported the conclusion. They could explain why the case was considered cleared by identification, even though prosecution was impossible. What they could not honestly claim was a fully narrated motive or a minute-by-minute route into the family's life. And that honesty is part of what gives the result weight. The public is more likely to trust a case when investigators acknowledge what they still do not know. In old files especially, certainty should be used sparingly. Here, it could be used for identity. Elsewhere, caution remained proper. That balance kept the Walker case from becoming a legend with a neat ending. It remained what it always had been, a real investigation involving real limitations, real grief, and finally, a real answer. If you imagine the file at this stage, it feels different from the one opened in 1959. The first file was full of fresh interviews and uncertain roads. The later file contained lab reports, genealogical charts, and family line comparisons. But both versions were trying to answer the same simple question: who did this? The first version could not answer. The later one could. That continuity across forms is striking. Paper to biology, witnesses to relatives, local deputies to modern specialists. Different tools, same question. And because the question remained the same, the eventual answer did not feel like a new story laid over the old one. It felt like the old story finally speaking more clearly. There is another point worth noticing. The solving of the Walker case depended not just on what evidence existed, but on what evidence was chosen for modern use. Cold case work always involves selection. A file may hold hundreds of pages and many items, but only some can be tested meaningfully. Investigators have to decide where the strongest path lies. In this case, biological material became the path because it offered something witness statements no longer could: fixed identity. That strategic choice reflects maturity in cold case practice. Rather than reopening every old theory at once, detectives asked which part of the file had the best chance of producing a person rather than another speculation. They followed that path, and it led them to Kane. Once there, the older theories were not discarded. They were measured against the new center. Some fit better. Some faded away. That is how good cold case work often proceeds. It does not preserve every old idea equally. It lets stronger evidence reorganize the past. And that reorganization has consequences. The route through Florida matters differently once the suspect is understood as a probable drifter with a violent past. The lack of a local personal motive matters differently once the suspect appears to have entered the story from outside the family's known circle. The long absence of an arrest matters differently once the offender is someone whose life may never have intersected cleanly with early law enforcement suspicion. All of those old puzzles become less mysterious once the center is named. Not simple, just less diffuse. That reduction of diffusion is in many ways the emotional heart of the case's resolution. For more than 4 decades, the Walker murders spread outward in the imagination. Once Cain was identified, they began to gather inward, toward one person, one family line, one explanation supported strongly enough to stand. And even then, one final responsibility